Thanks, Namu. Hello, everybody. I'd like to thank the members of the Trust for joining this evening, and also to welcome other members of the public, especially those joining our Medicine for Members programme for the first time. I'm Julia Loudon. I've been a patient governor at CUH since 2015. And governors provide a direct link to both the Trust patients and the local community. In our role as governors, we represent the interests of patients and the wider public, and we meet regularly with members of the board of directors of the Trust who have the operational responsibility for running the hospitals. Patients and members of the public who become members of the Trust are able to learn about how Addenbrooke's and the Rosie hospitals are run, and can also get involved in activities within the Trust. Members can also vote in governor elections, and if interested, you can put yourselves forward to stand for election. The next elections are going to take place in the next few months, so if you're interested in becoming a member, please contact the membership office. If you're not already a member and are interested in finding out more, there's information on becoming a member, on being a member, and being a governor on the Trust website, and that's www.cuh.nhs.uk. And through there, you can scroll through to many areas of interest. Moving on now to the main event, tonight's lecture. Well, the topic for tonight's lecture is a really fascinating one, and is improving the diagnosis of dementia in memory clinics. Can machine learning help? The session will be in two parts. Dr. Tim Rittman will give a presentation discussing the latest understanding of dementia, when it begins and how to detect it. And then he'll be joined by Professors Zoe Coetzee and Guy Williams to discuss how a team of doctors and researchers are using new technologies with machine learning to support a more accurate diagnosis and to provide information not currently available to doctors about prognosis and disease severity. I'll just give you a quick bio on the presenters who will be talking to us. Dr. Tim Rittman is a neurology consultant in the Addenbrooke's Memory Clinic, the Dementia Genetics Clinic, and specialist clinics for rare neurodegenerative diseases. He's a clinical academic leading a research program that uses brain imaging, cognitive tests, and pathology data to understand how dementia spreads through the brain. As part of this work, he has an interest in bringing machine learning and artificial intelligence methods to the Memory Clinic. He leads the imaging working group of the Deep Dementia Phenotyping, the DEMON Network. It's an international group of researchers interested in big data for dementia, and he's an advisor of the World Young Leaders in Dementia. More locally, he's the NIHR Eastern Region Specialty Lead for Neurodegeneration, and he's a clinical director of studies and a fellow at Peterhouse. Zoe Coetzee is Professor of Computational Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Cambridge and is an Alan Turing Fellow. Her research aims to develop predictive AI-guided models of neurodegenerative research and mental health with translational impact in early diagnosis and personalised interventions. Zoe received her PhD from Rutgers University and was a postdoctoral fellow at MIT and Harvard. She was a senior research scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics, and then a chair in brain imaging at the University of Birmingham before moving to the University of Cambridge in 2013. She's a Royal Society Industry Fellow and Cambridge University lead at the Alan Turing Institute and the Scientific Director for Alzheimer's Research UK Initiative on Early Detection and Neurodegenerative Diseases. Guy Williams is a Professor of Imaging Science in the University and the Associate Director of the Wolfson Brain Imaging Centre. His research interests lie in magnetic resonance imaging acquisition, analysis, and informatics. Within the Wolfson Brain Imaging Centre, he's worked broadly across research contexts in neurology, psychiatry, and psychology, implementing methods to help understanding the imaging correlates of disease and function. So without further ado, I'll just pass across to Tim.
Great. Thanks very much, Julia, for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be invited to talk to this really quite unique and special meeting. So I'll just get my screen sharing sorted out and we'll get started. I hope you can see that. Can I just check that you can see the slides changing as well there?
Yeah, we can, Tim.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So my work as a neurologist in the memory clinic really tries to do the best that we can do for the patients in Cambridge and Cambridgeshire, but also we'll talk about how that links in with the research and how we're trying to drive up standards in the memory clinic and try and improve that diagnosis for people both within our region and further afield. So we'll talk a bit about, firstly, what is dementia? What do we mean by that?
Sorry, Tim, we've lost you.
Yep, sorry, I was muted briefly for some reason.
He was muted.
Is that better now? Right. I'll talk about some of my work trying to pick up dementia, the signs of dementia as early as possible, and how we're turning to technology and machine learning to try and improve the diagnosis and prognosis in memory clinics. We're using machine learning and AI for other things, for example, in neuropathology and in other parts of our neuroimaging research. But I'll talk today about work that's very clinically focused. And at the end, we'll sort of talk about the future, and Guy and Zoe will sort of chip in at parts. So when we think about dementia, a lot of people think about Alzheimer's disease, about memory problems, and that's certainly the commonest type of dementia. But dementia is a group of cognitive neurodegenerative diseases, so wear and tear diseases of the brain that affect memory and thinking, they affect different parts of the brain and cause different symptoms. So Alzheimer's disease, yes, it does affect memory, but it also affects coordination. It can affect vision and visual processing. Whereas other diseases such as frontotemporal dementia affects the front of the brain, so it doesn't have such an impact on memory, but may affect behavior and people who become quite disinhibited. Or a disease like progressive supranuclear palsy, or PSP for short, affects some cognition to some extent, but also movement as well. So these sort of wear and tear diseases affect different parts of
movement.
It gets a bit more complicated than that. So when we see people in clinic, we can pick up some of these changes in behavior and memory and thinking and movement, and we map those onto a set of diagnoses. So here, Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia. I think there's one who may not be muted. So
Parkinsonian, that's different.
Be grateful if you could just check that if you could mute yourself, please. That'd be wonderful. So we put these sort of memory and thinking and movement problems together to make these sort of clinical diagnoses about Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, or motor neuron disease. Under the bonnet, there's changes in the brain of these little clumps of protein that build up in brain cells and sort of gum up the system, if you like, alongside other disease processes. And as you can see here, the situation's a bit complicated because there are different proteins and they don't map one-to-one onto the diagnoses that we make in clinic, and the diagnoses can cause lots of different symptoms, which is a challenge in the field of neurodegeneration and makes an accurate diagnosis challenging. So where are we with treatments for these disorders? Well, there are some treatments that are being developed to target particularly these different proteins, and the one that's probably furthest along are treatments for this amyloid protein, which kicked off a few years with solanezumab, and in the last year, aducanumab and lecanemab have been in the news. And these are what we call monoclonal antibodies. So they target this protein in the brain, and they try and get rid of this amyloid protein in the hope that will improve memory and thinking and cognition. And what we know from this study from lecanemab, which was published fairly recently, is that lecanemab is fantastic at getting rid of this amyloid protein in the brain. And you can see here the people who didn't get the drug in the placebo group do have lots of amyloid still, and the people who get the lecanemab, that really drops right down. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a huge effect on people's memory and thinking. So on a sort of 18-point scale, there's about a 0.4 point improvement. So to put that in context, the current medications that we use, things like donepezil, Aricept, have about double that effect. So I don't think this is going to be the drug which really revolutionizes our clinical care, but it's a really important step in the right direction that we've got at least a hint that we can change this disease. One of the challenges of these medications, and perhaps one of the reasons why they're not having as big effect as we think, is that we're picking up people very late on in the disease process. By the time people develop symptoms, we know that the disease is well on its way, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And what we'd really like to do is pick people up as early as possible, so we can put them into treatment trials, recruit them into prevention trials as well, changing lifestyle, and not just target the beta amyloid protein, but the tau protein and other disease processes. So what's the current situation? That's looking ahead, but where are we at the moment? So this was a quote from an email from one of my patients' husbands. And some people do manage to live well with their dementia and have a certain quality of life. But for a lot of people, these are really devastating diseases. They are terminal diseases. They are progressive.
Excuse me, we can't see the slides.
Right. I'll stop sharing and share again. Let me just. Let's just try it in a slightly different way. I hope that's better now. Yeah. So can you see the slides now? Julie, is that okay?
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
I can see.
Yeah, I think there seems to be a sort of variety of people who can hear, people who can't hear, people who can see the slides and not see the slides. So I'm sorry. I think Teams is not having a great day in general, according to the news. So I'm sorry that's affecting the talk. So it's just going to talk through what the situation is at the moment in terms of how we make a diagnosis and what happens when you come to a memory clinic. So at the basis of that is a sort of history and examination. So going through someone's story of what's happened to them and examining them. And from that, we can get a reasonable idea of what we think is going on in the brain. We can add to that some extra information with cognitive tests and brain scans. And the brain scans firstly can exclude other problems like strokes or brain tumors or inflammation that might be causing memory and thinking problems. And the cognitive test can show us what patterns of cognitive impairment people have, whether it's affecting just memory, whether it's affecting their sort of language abilities, and so on. We can put those patterns together to identify particular conditions. If we're not sure at that point, we can add some more information. We have a really excellent neuropsychology service here at Addenbrooke's, and we would struggle to do a lot of what we do in the memory clinic without them. And they're great at supporting us in doing assessments for diagnosis and supporting people in the longer term as well. And we can also do biomarkers. By that, I mean lumbar punctures. And we're also at the moment developing a regional service to do blood tests for Alzheimer's disease, which are fairly new in the last few years. So all of these are slightly indirect. We're not, getting a bit of the brain out and looking at it under a microscope, because we can't really do that very easily. Most of my patients object to that, quite understandably, but we can get a reasonable idea, and we think we're pretty accurate when we do make a diagnosis. But we're quite a specialist centre here. We've got lots of experience, and we've been doing this for a long time. We're the first memory clinic to be established in the UK. But if you look across the country, it's not quite the same standard, and you don't quite get the same accuracy of diagnosis depending on where you live, and there's not the same access to some of these investigations as well. So this is from an audit of memory clinics a couple of years ago. And I've just picked out two conditions here. So one is dementia with Lewy bodies, which is a little bit like Parkinson's disease. And from what we know about the sort of how common this is, we'd expect about 4% of people coming to memory clinics to have dementia with Lewy bodies. But when we look, actually, it's half that number. So we know that half these people with this condition are not getting an accurate diagnosis. For frontotemporal dementia, that disease I mentioned earlier, which affects the front of the brain, causes people to be disinhibited and so on, that's even worse. So we'd expect about 2% of people to have that diagnosis, and we're getting 0.2% of people actually receiving that diagnosis.
Disinhibited, they just...
I don't know whether there's still a few people chatting in the background, so if you could check whether you're muted, I'd appreciate that. Thank you. So really, we're only catching 10% of the people who have this diagnosis, and that's a big impact in what to expect in the future, in the particular management strategies and treatments that we use for people. When we look across, even within diagnoses, we see differences. So we can get a bit of an idea about what will happen to the future based on a diagnosis. So we know if you have PSP, progressive supranuclear palsy, it's quite an aggressive disease. Your survival is likely to be 2 or 3 years from the point of diagnosis. With semantic dementia, that's much longer, and this is data from our own memory clinic here. But even within, say, Alzheimer's disease or within behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia, there's a massive variability in what will happen in the future. And at the moment, we have no way of being able to predict whether with Alzheimer's disease you'll survive for 3 years or whether you'll survive for sort of 8 or 9 years. So how can we address that? So firstly, let's talk a little bit about early detection. And one of the sort of key questions here is how early can we actually pick up some of these signs and symptoms of dementia and neurodegenerative disease? And we haven't really known that until recently. We've suspected there is subtle early changes, but we haven't really been known for certain. So this work was done by Noel Swadhyarupong, who is now one of our neurology junior doctors, and he started this when he was a medical student. And we use the biobank data set. So this is about 500,000 people, including my mother-in-law, who come along for tests and surveys. And this is in the age range of people who are likely to develop these sorts of neurodegenerative diseases in the next few years. And a number of them have done. And these are the sort of numbers of people from that 500,000 who have gone on to get these diagnoses. So we asked a fairly simple question, really. So these people have been followed up for sort of between 5 and 9 years, depending on the diagnosis. And what were they like when they first came along to those tests? Could we pick up anything at those baseline assessments 5 to 9 years before they got a diagnosis? So these are the sorts of tests that people had. So one of the things we looked at was fluid intelligence. So this is how flexible your thinking is. You can work this out if you particularly fancy it. It's quite a hard test. And certainly when I'm on the spot with 100 odd people looking at me, there's no way I'm going to get this answer right. But when we look at this sort of fluid intelligence, what we can see is that in these people who went on to get a diagnosis of a neurodegenerative disease, years earlier, they were worse at these tests. Not massively worse, but a bit worse. This is sort of analysis called a Bayesian analysis. I won't go into too much detail, but basically, if you're in this shaded yellow area here, you're normal, and below that area, there's some impairment on the test. So you can see that Alzheimer's disease here, people with frontotemporal dementia, people with PSP, all did much worse or a little bit worse on these tests of fluid intelligence. People with Parkinson's disease did as well as the healthy group did. So there's a subtle change in fluid intelligence years before people get a diagnosis. And that was, I won't show you all the results, but when we look at specific diseases, we can see specific changes. So when we do a memory test, for example, we see changes in Alzheimer's disease. So this is a sort of memory test that people shown. It's not too tricky. You flashed up with these pairs here, and then they hide the boxes, and you have to say where the pairs were. And again, you can see here's the shaded box of how the sort of healthy people did, and the people who went on to get Alzheimer's disease did worse on this memory test. So what we've been able to show for the first time in these neurodegenerative diseases, there are subtle changes years before people get a diagnosis or have really noticed those symptoms. And these are across the board in this sort of fluid intelligence, and then there are changes that are specific to these different neurodegenerative conditions. So it's not specific enough to say, well, if we do this test, we'll definitely know that you'll get a type of dementia in the future. So we have to turn to other ways of trying to pick things up. And one of the ways that is a potential way of looking at this is looking at brain scans. So here on the left, you can see a sort of normal, healthy-looking brain, and on the right, a brain of someone with Alzheimer's disease, and you can see that there is some shrinkage of the brain, and the spaces in and around the brain are starting to open up as the brain wears away. So what's the best way to look at these brain scans and to try and pick up subtle early changes? Well, can artificial intelligence help? And there's a lot of interest and dare say hype around this. So a few years ago, when we were starting to set up this study, it got picked up by the BBC, and Pallab Ghosh wrote this lovely report about it, and then it got picked up by various other newspapers and so on. And some of my colleagues said, oh, we read about you in the Times or in the Guardian or the Telegraph, as a sort of paragraph somewhere in the middle of the paper. None of them had noticed, for some reason, that we were front page of the Express. Although one of my colleagues, Alistair Coles, did point out that we'd done very well to get onto the front page of a newspaper without actually having any results yet, which is partly true. We did have some initial results, but it just sort of demonstrates the interest and the hype around artificial intelligence and this sort of technology for helping in this sort of area. So firstly, what is AI and artificial intelligence? Well, it's a group of mathematical algorithms or methods which are trying to reproduce that sort of gut feeling pattern recognition which we have as humans. So it uses the data to find these patterns, and it learns. So the more data that you give these algorithms, the better it should be. And things have changed quite a lot. So Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov in chess in '97 using these sort of algorithm-based methods where it looked at lots of chess games and picked out the best thing to do in this particular move, in this particular situation based on those games. Whereas when Lee Sedol was beaten by AlphaGo, which is used a completely different set of methods. AlphaGo is a sort of order of magnitude more difficult than chess. And a number of people thought that it wasn't going to be possible for computers to beat human players at Go. And this AlphaGo algorithm hadn't seen a game of Go. It was just told the rules. And then it went and basically played games against itself and worked out the best strategies and beat a human. So these algorithms are called deep learning algorithms, and really have transformed over the past sort of 10, 20 years, and continuing to develop in terms of their sort of capabilities. So can we take advantage of these advances in these technologies for dementia diagnosis? One of the challenges of these sort of studies that have been done so far is that they're in very highly selected, very well curated research cohorts, which are quite different from the sort of messy, sort of noisy data that we get from memory clinics. So people who tend to sign up for sort of studies like the UK Biobank, like my mother-in-law, for example, tend to be from fairly well-off backgrounds. They tend to be white on the whole and middle class. And the people who come to memory clinics are much more heterogeneous. They have other diseases, which can make the diagnosis more challenging. So we've set up this study in now 9 different NHS memory clinics around the country, both from sort of specialised memory clinics like the one in Addenbrooke's, and from community-based psychiatry-led memory clinics like the ones my colleagues in Cambridgeshire. And we're now just over 500 people recruited into this over the last sort of 18 months or so, and we're continuing to build this data set so that we can then test some of these AI algorithms, machine learning algorithms in clinical practice. So I'm going to hand over now to Zoe, who's developed a particular machine learning algorithm, just to talk through how we've been using some of this data to do exactly that.
Great, thank you, Tim, and thank you for the opportunity to present today our work to you all and get some feedback. So, Tim, do you mind progressing the slides?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Wonderful. So, well, I'm here today to tell you that machine learning and artificial intelligence is not just a hype. As Tim said, when the press picked this up about 2 summers ago, we had preliminary data. But now, actually, thanks to collaborating with Tim and also with Kai and a team of really talented early career researchers, we have been able to validate these algorithms and also apply them to clinical data. So we have built a set of these smart artificial intelligence algorithms that have learned patterns by training on lots and lots of research data. And this is thanks to patients and volunteers that allow us to access their data. And what we're interested in developing is a tool that can predict dementia early, precisely, and from data that are as least invasive as possible and as least expensive, as least costly as possible. So we look here into algorithms that learn from brain scans, and this is just a simple structural scan that takes 5 minutes, and cognitive data scales, clinical scales that are collected in the memory clinic. And that's exactly what our tool does. It links to the scanners, it takes the brain scans and it links to databases in the NHS and pools the clinical scores and puts them together, and is been trained on a lot of research data and can now predict on this patient data. So if we could have the next slide, please. Great, wonderful. So one advantage of these algorithms is that it doesn't look at only one data type. So if one data type is a little bit weaker in its predictions, especially when we're at very early stages of dementia, or even when we are before any symptoms occur, which is the right time to predict so that we can intervene, then the algorithm will combine it with other data that might have other information and really learns about these complex interactions between different data types. And the model is trained to be really robust by looking at brain scans, by looking at genetics, by looking at biomarkers, for example, amyloid and tau, that we know they are very important for Alzheimer's disease, and cognitive scales. But the beauty of this is that the model then does not need only all of this data. All that it needs is one brain scan, the very first brain scan, and some cognitive tests, some scales, to make predictions about new patients. And this model looks into classifying the patients into whether they will remain stable or whether they will progress at these early stages, for example, a stage of mild cognitive impairment, but also tells us how quickly people will progress into Alzheimer's disease. And so it gives us an idea of their brain health trajectories. So if we could go on to the next slide. Great, thank you. So this is actually real data from the model. What you see here is the model actually has really good accuracy, sensitivity, and specificity, and it can reduce the misdiagnosis. And it gives us a score that describes how far each individual is from a stable prototype and how quickly they are moving towards disease. And what you see is that based on these scores, we can classify the patients and stratify them more precisely into patients that will remain stable. For example, this is the green bars that you see, compared to patients that they start moving towards Alzheimer's disease, some of them more slowly and some of them rapidly than others. And so we have done this work with Tim where we run the algorithm on patient data, and only Tim has the clinical diagnosis. And then we open the scores and we open the diagnosis. And what you see here is that the model correctly predicts that patients that have already been diagnosed as Alzheimer's are moving rapidly in terms of their cognitive decline compared to patients that have been diagnosed as mild cognitive impairment or patients that have subjective memory complaints that potentially don't have dementia pathology. Now, the interesting thing is that at the bottom of this graph, what you see is these dots. These represent data of individuals that have no symptoms. And the model can make predictions that some of them will remain stable, but some of them will progress. And that's really interesting in terms of how early actually we can predict based on these powerful and robust tools. If I could have the next slide, please. So this is really exciting because we can now move from research data to real world data. This is data from patients. This is not data from volunteers that come and engage in our studies. This is the patients that go to the memory clinic and see Tim as a consultant, and he shares with patient permission the data with the algorithm. We actually don't need to see the data. We are aiming to have a fully automated tool. And what you see here, again, you can see these three bins where how patients are stratified. In the green bin, patients that, for example, have attentional memory symptoms, these are stable patients according to the model. They will not move towards dementia. Mild cognitive impairment patients kind of straddle from stable. Some of them maybe will remain stable and maybe have been misdiagnosed and a more careful assessment is needed. And some of them are moving slowly. So there is space here for intervention, for example, through lifestyle factors. And then what you see is the patients that they are already diagnosed as Alzheimer's. Some of them are progressing faster than others, as we would expect. So we could have the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So how can these tools now can robustly allow us to actually change the clinical pathway? And this is what we are aiming. We aim to have a fully automated pipeline that will pool the data, the scans, and the clinical data of the patients, run them through the algorithm, make robust predictions, and then can allow the clinician to work based on this scores to make a diagnostic as an advisory kind of score. And then we can change the clinical pathway by stratifying patients better and more precisely into these categories. So stable patients can return home. They probably do not need any more invasive and quite stressful diagnostic tests like PET scans and lumbar punctures, saving quite a lot of money to the NHS, and also can now afford to go home without being anxious about a further diagnosis. Slowly progressive patients are patients that can return to the community with a lot of support and care and of course be reviewed. And rapidly progressive patients is potentially where, as we've seen, the new drugs potentially might be making a difference and need potentially immediate hospitalization and more care. If we could have the next slide, please. Right, thank you. So this is really where we are. We have built an automated system that we are now, thanks to Guy and a lot of work from the informatics perspective at the hospital, we are trying to integrate really within the NHS. We have validated in clinical data, and we're hoping to be able now to put in longer term clinical trials to see what difference it makes when the data that we get from patients are not just reviewed by clinicians in terms of looking by the naked eye, but can be run through these algorithms that have seen thousands and thousands of cases of individuals and can make these robust predictions that can then advise the clinician. And I think the next slide is for Guy.
Yeah, I think I was going to talk about the sort of integration into clinics. So.
Yeah, oh, you're going to talk about it. Okay, great, thank you.
That's fine. So I'll speak to the same slide actually. So everyone's heard already from Tim about the sort of potential for AI, and from Zoe on the sort of specific theory that we've been developing. I'm at the Wilson Brain Imaging Centre, and I guess this is the space in which we're trying to get this to work in practice in the Cambridge context. We've got lots of data sites. I think Tim mentioned 9 QMIN sites that will be running similar types of pipelines. But essentially, a lot of the brain scans that run through Tim's memory clinic are actually done in the Wilson Brain Imaging Centre, which is actually formerly a part of the university, but set up for clinical scanning as well. And that gives us relatively easy access to the data for sort of research purposes, and we're not quite at the point of this being a routine clinical tool yet, but the next step that we need to do is to make it look like one so that it can be evaluated as though it is a clinical tool. So the data that's generated in the WBIC can be piped directly into the research engine that we've been developing to try and make this as much to look a lot less like this sort of standard research tools with command line work and sort of back-end computers. Port in the clinical scores, the cognitive scores that are coming from the memory clinic as well, and then spit out the sort of results that you saw on some of the slides from Zoe. And this is really essentially working now in the Cambridge context, and we're hoping that it will, generate some data that we'll be able to test in sort of real world data in the same way that Tim's been already alluding to using the algorithms that Zoe described. And obviously that will move into the future, which Tim, I think, will close the talk by talking about a bit more.
Yeah, so I'll just sort of wrap up really with a sort of brief sort of think about, well, what will the memory clinic of the future look like? And I think, you know, still at the heart of it will be that sort of clinician-patient relationship, either a doctor or a nurse, seeing people face to face and talking to them, speaking to them, taking that history and examination. We will have all this information that we sort of previously talked about from cognitive tests and brain scans and biomarkers. But what we'll be able to do with the AI tools, I think, really is squeeze as much information out of those tests as possible, and that will help us to do more in terms of support and treatment. It will help us give more accurate diagnoses and a better idea of prognoses and what's going to happen in the future. And I've just put a sort of list here of the things which I think this will help with. At the moment, I would argue really we're okay at differential diagnosis. I think this AI tool will improve that. But all of the other things I've listed here, I don't think we can do at the moment unless we really make use of this technology in terms of prognosis, knowing what's going to happen in the future. When are people going to be admitted to care homes or hospital admission? Really early on, what are people's future risk of dementia, and how should we feed people into trials or treatments for prevention and stopping or slowing down this treatment, these conditions. So just a sort of thank you slide at the end. I've sort of combined all the people from our different lab groups who have been working on this. This is a picture of my lab group, but there are other people as well, and our collaborators from across the UK and further afield. And a huge thank you to the NHS partners, both CUH, CPFT, our sort of Community Psychiatry Trust, and the people who funded this. We've got generous funding from a Wellcome Innovation grant. My own research and a lot of this is really centred in the Cambridge Biomedical Research Centre. And I can't emphasise how important it is to have that to enable this sort of research, and also through the MRC. So we'll have to stop there and take questions.
Thank you very much to Tim and Zoe and Guy for their presentation. And I'm sorry to see in the chat that there was such a problem with the sound and earlier on in some of the slides. I can't actually see any questions in the chat. So if anybody does have any questions, can you put them in there and then we can raise them. But just as we're going, I have a quick question about, you mentioned it near the end, Tim, about how it will affect future treatments when you get such early diagnosis, but is it already directing researchers to new approaches that might be helpful, therapeutic approaches that might be helpful very early in the disease?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of advances in terms of the sort of imaging that we're able to do. And a lot of this is happening at the Wolfson Brain Imaging Centre, in terms of not just MRI scans but PET scans, where we can look at some of these proteins that build up in the brain. We can look at processes like inflammation, which are turning out to be very useful and important. And another part of my work is using some of these AI machine learning models to combine data from MRI, from PET scans, even from neuropathology, from post-mortem data, to try and work out how all these different disease processes work together. I don't know, Guy, if you want to say something about the sort of imaging side of things. I think
Seems to have gone.
I think Guy's disappeared. Sorry.
While we wait, should I just, there have a few questions have now been put in the chat. So the first question is, what is the referral pathway to the memory clinic? Yeah, so most people at the moment will notice some memory and thinking problems. For the most part, it's the sort of family or sort of friends who will notice those problems more than the patient themselves. And then they will see their GP, who will do some brief screening assessment and be referred to the memory clinic from there. And depending on what the question is, whether at Addenbrooke's, we tend to see people who have young onset dementia in their sort of 50s or 60s, or unusual types of dementia, like the frontotemporal dementia I mentioned earlier, or there's some language type dementias and so on.
and there's also a fantastic psychiatry-led community memory service who are fantastic at supporting people at home in their local communities as well. So that's the sort of pathway at the moment.
Okay. The next question is about the calibration of the AI. How is that done?
I think I'll leave that to Zoe. Best place.
Okay, and now Zoe. Ah, there you are.
Yeah, I'm here. Hi. So the calibration. Yeah, as I said, we work with a lot of data, and we look at, for example, databases of 500 to 1,000 patients, and we need to ensure that what predictions the algorithms made are validated. So one of the things we do is we leave out some of that data. We don't feed them into the algorithms while we train the algorithms, and then we test on completely independent data sets. We do this within the same kind of cohort data to start with. So we say, let's say we take one cohort, one research cohort, one sample, we leave out one part of that data. We repeat this many times, leaving out many parts, and then we look at what is the prediction accuracy of these models over many thousands of iterations. Now, the other thing that we do is we look at completely different data. So we might look at a completely different cohort, for example, and we test again whether our algorithms trained on one data set can make predictions that are validated on a completely different data set. Now, when we come to clinical data, we don't train the algorithms on the clinical data. We have trained the algorithms on research data. They are really robust, and then we test on clinical data. What's really interesting is one could ask the question of, well, how do we know that the algorithms are making the right prediction if we are using baseline data? What's really interesting, we have a collaboration with clinicians that have tracked patients for a long time. And we start with the data for these patients early on at the very first assessment. We make predictions, and then the clinicians open for us the labels over time. And so then we can see whether the predictions of the algorithm actually match the clinical diagnosis over time. And we have seen really good, really well matching results when the algorithms, for example, predict that patients will remain stable, the diagnosis doesn't change at all. And when the algorithms predict that a patient will move fast towards Alzheimer's disease, we see a much faster change in clinical diagnosis. So this is the way that we, during the training, but also during the test, we try to calibrate and validate the algorithms to ensure that they are robust and also transparent.
Okay, I think this is a linked question, so I'll ask it here. When you say stable, how far out are you predicting that there will be no change in cognition? Yeah, so this depends on what data we have, and so far we have worked with data that where patients are tracked between 5 to 10 years. So this is the range, and we would like to be able to go even earlier, but we have to have the data for this. But the reason for that is because we know that the causes of dementia happen in the brain 10 to 15 years before symptoms. So if we have the data and we're able to predict as early as that, then actually we can intervene with, for example, change in lifestyle. When Tim mentioned UK Biobank, this is a data set that we are really counting on in terms of most of the individuals participating in the UK Biobank are healthy, but over time, potentially they might be moving into different diseases. And that's where if these patients are tracked for a long time, we will have this data to go as much earlier and validate the algorithms. Thank you. There's another question here about the memory clinics. What does monitoring of patients by the memory clinics in the future look like?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think someone's sharing their screen. I think it's Lorna Williamson is, I think, accidentally sharing this screen. I think you might want to stop that. So I think at the moment we follow people by repeating memory and thinking tests. There's a move to try and make some of those memory and thinking tests easier to do at home. with tablets and phones and things like that. So you can do a test on a more regular basis. There are some groups who are using sort of AI methods to track people in their natural environment. So you might have cameras around the home which track your movements and perhaps even listen to your speech, or we all have these watches nowadays, track your sort of movement and sleep patterns, and use that to make to measure how the disease is progressing. So I think that's an interesting avenue of research. There's questions about privacy there. Do people want cameras in their home watching them the whole time? It's an interesting idea that you move from doing pen and paper cognitive tests every year to actually more, or every 6 months, to more sort of real world observation using AI.
The next question is asking how we can take part in this trial if we suspect early stage dementia.
So for this particular study, we're taking people from the memory clinic. So you have to come to either my memory clinic or one of the participating memory clinics to take part. But there's a fantastic website called Join Dementia Research, and if you just Google Join Dementia Research, it's run by the Alzheimer's Research UK and the Alzheimer's Society. It's supported by the government, and you can sign up to that, and various different dementia studies or researchers can go onto that website and get in touch with you if you sort of fit the bill, if you like, for what they're looking for. So we've certainly used that as a resource in Cambridge to recruit people for different studies. So yeah, Join Dementia Research. It's a way to go.
Okay. The next question is asking about when people actually go to memory clinics, that if they're referred to a memory clinic, then they're already struggling with difficulties. So is this early enough for diagnosis? Yeah,
it's a real challenge. And I've talked a lot about early diagnosis, but I think it's probably better to talk about a timely diagnosis because people have different views on this as well. When there've been surveys asking even relatives of people with dementia, do you want to know your future risk? Do you want to know if you're going to get dementia in a few years' time? It's very polarized between those who do and those who don't want to know. And you could argue, on the one hand, yes, you want to know what's going to happen in the future, so you can put plans in place, be involved in these early clinical trials, change your lifestyle, and so on. The flip side of that is that comes with a certain amount of anxiety and worry about the future. And you could argue that we should all be living as if we're going to get dementia in the future and make plans and sort of do things which are going to reduce our risk of dementia. So I think in terms of the people who come to clinic at the moment, we see a big range of severity. Some people who have very sort of subtle early changes, and some people who you think, well, if you'd have come a year or two ago, we could have done a lot more for you. So I think in some cases it's early, it's not early enough, but there's a debate to be had as to what the right time for the diagnosis is.
The next question links to this in terms of it's asking about risk factors. Is your team concentrating on research, or are you also looking into preventative measures, encouraging people to change their lifestyle, looking at risk factors and addressing them? What are specific risk factors that people could actually help change?
Yeah, so we're looking particularly at that sort of diagnosis in this study. But what I've done in another study is use a sort of AI algorithm using brain imaging again to look specifically at Alzheimer's disease in the UK, in the imaging bit of the UK Biobank. I didn't talk about this study, but we've managed to identify people who look like they have Alzheimer-like brain changes on their brain scan. And they have some risk factors, so they have higher blood pressure and they smoke more. So from that sense, I think some of this early detection will help pick up what risk factors people have and what we might be able to change. There are massive collaborations around the world. So there's one called the Worldwide Fingers Study, which is trying to put into place lifestyle changes and see if it can reduce people's dementia risk. I'll be honest, the results from that are not wildly exciting so far. They haven't really managed to make a big difference, but I think that it's quite hard to change your lifestyle, particularly once you're getting into your sort of 40s, 50s and 60s when these things make a difference. It's quite hard to change what you eat and your exercise patterns and things, which are set really very early in life.
Okay. The next question is looking at how likely it might run in families. So the question is, both my parents have or had Alzheimer's. Would it benefit me to get tested? My mother also has frontal lobe dementia.
So in general, the likelihood of having a genetic type of Alzheimer's disease is really low. So I part of my job is to run the dementia genetics clinic, and it's not a very well attended clinic, I'm very pleased to say, because these are rare. The way we approach the genetic testing is we firstly test someone who has a disease if there's a high risk of a genetic cause. So there are particular types of dementia where there is a stronger genetic risk than others, and in those we would offer people a genetic test. Even in those types of dementia, it's still rare to find a gene that's passed down from generation to generation, but that's the way we sort of approach it. So there isn't a reason to get tested unless you've got symptoms or unless there's really strong family history of onset where lots of people have had dementia in their 40s or early 50s. There is a bit of so that's in the sort of those very strong genetic risks. There's a lot more research these days into genetic risk factors, so combinations of genes which might push you 1 or 2% towards or away from getting dementia. So if you do have a relative with dementia, you're at slightly more increased risk than anyone else walking down the street. That's not to say that risk is very high, and it's not the sort of risk that we can easily test for, but there is a slight family association based on these sort of different combinations and patterns of genes, and that's certainly going into a lot of these risk prediction scores which people are developing nowadays.
Okay, and the next question is on AI. Do you think AI will in the future facilitate large-scale early detection as a routine for those above a certain age?
I mean, that's a really good question, isn't it? Well, do we want that? What would you do? What would you do about it? I mean, I think I don't know. Zoe and Guy might have a view on this as well. But I think until we've got a definite intervention, which is going to definitely make a big difference to people, I don't think we should do that. Can we do it? Potentially, yes. But I think the question is more, should we do it? So I think it won't be too long away. We're not too far away from having the capability to be able to do mass screening for early dementia if we want to. I don't know, Zoe, or Guy, what do you think? You're muted, Guy. Sorry.
I agree completely. I think it's a lot. What are you doing it for? I think is a good question. And there's a huge degree of certainty yet to come with AI, isn't it? We're not there in terms of the degree of confidence one would have about early at this stage is not there. And what would you do?
Well, I think if I may say, I think we see really kind of good evidence for more precise stratification, which can make a difference not only in clinical practice, but actually can make a big difference in clinical trials. And so one of the difficulties in clinical trials is when patients are recruited, there's a lot of heterogeneity, as you showed, Tim. And this, of course, then will have an effect when you compare your drug target versus your placebo group. And no effects might be seen because of the heterogeneity in the patients. Actually, there is more and more evidence that with better stratification of patients and then assignment into clinical trial groups, that can really improve the success of the clinical trials and can also cut down a lot the time that clinical trials take, so make them more efficient and more cost effective. And that potentially has impact in drug target development. And so I think that's where really AI could help at this point before we have more data that is fully validated in clinical practice.
Thank you. I think we're coming to the end of our session, unfortunately. There are 2 questions left, which I think have been addressed to some extent about where the clinic's found. If you go into the Joint Dementia Research, you should be able to get some information on that. Is that correct, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, this particular study is sort of in memory clinics. In some ways, I don't want volunteers for this clinic, for this particular study. I want people that don't normally get involved in research. So if you're interested in volunteering, please do, but not for my study. Because I want people who don't get involved in research to do it.
And we discussed a little bit about the interventions to reduce risk. You'd mentioned some of those. And there's a final question about, could COVID be a risk factor for the future?
So I think COVID is really interesting because firstly, COVID doesn't get into the brain. We sort of know this from sort of pathology studies and so on. And we haven't seen a big wave of people with dementia coming to the clinic after COVID. However, COVID is a good model of a severe illness. And I think there's a lot to be understood about how severe illness affects the brain in general and cognitive function in general. And there are a number of studies which are looking into this. So I'm not concerned that COVID is going to be a big risk factor in terms of a virus that gets into the brain and causes dementia, because I don't think it does that. But it will be interesting to see whether an effect of sort of severe disease might be seen further down the line.
Okay, I think we'll now have to close the discussion. Thanks everybody for joining us this evening, and obviously thanks to Tim, Guy and Zoe for a really interesting and thought-provoking session on an area that obviously can affect any of us as we grow older. We'd be grateful if you could complete a short survey. There will be a link in the chat box that you can use, and then a recording of this webinar will be posted on the CUH website and the YouTube channel by the end of next week, and hopefully that could address some of the sound issues that people had early on. I do hope so, and I do apologise for that. So thanks everybody for attending, and thanks again very much to our presenters for their talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
It's very interesting.